Literature reviews. As discussed in the previous slide series, developing a research project begins at the very beginning with developing your research idea and the developing your research questions before moving on to the other stages of the research process. So the first step is about putting thought into working out what you are going to try and investigate and why. The key questions that we need to actually understand and we need to ask are about what is already known, what are the key concepts and theories, how, what and why have others done what they have, what can we learn from those things, how does this inform choices around research strategy, our research question, our research design, and what does this actually say about the current state of knowledge. Reviewing existing literature, knowledge and research in the field is an essential step to understanding these particular questions. Following this, you can develop a research plan that will help you to develop your research and to answer your research questions. The general key steps in doing a literature review are outlined on this particular slide. We've got steps 1 through to 5. The first step is obviously to identify the relevant literature, so record your key information. The second step is to develop a framework to evaluate your literature. So that's about developing key things that you want to record about each particular type of each particular piece of literature that you look at. It's so that you develop a form of consistency across all the different research that you look at. So you're recording all the different key information in a useful way. Third thing is about critically evaluating your literature. So you need to critically evaluate each piece of literature. You need to look at its strengths, its weaknesses, the methodology, its influence on the conclusions, agreements, disagreements, and also controversies in its findings. You then need to move on to actually summarise how the literature that you've reviewed supports or does not support your research plan. Are your research plans, are they actually sort of complementary, or are they different with the literature that's been reviewed, and what does your research offer to the existing landscape of knowledge? The final thing is about then summarising how the literature reviewed is going to be used to develop your own research questions, theories, hypotheses, and research design. The skills involved in this process of reviewing literature are about critical thinking, and we go back to the thinking we've come across in the previous slide series. When thinking about literature and the literature that we are reviewing, we are needing to think about that literature critically, and we're going to need to ask questions about the things that we read to do with the what, who, where, when, how and why, as well as the what if, what next, and so what. These questions enable us to describe, analyse and evaluate what we have actually read. To record all the information that we've gathered from this process of literature reviewing and to make that process actually effective, i.e. that we're actually going to learn something from it and that we're able to use all the information that we've gathered to develop our own research, it's really important to become good at the skill of note-taking. Note-taking involves moving away from writing down everything to being able to evaluate what of the information we are seeing is actually important. Putting together the skills of critical thinking and note-taking means that we should be able to succinctly read an article and record it describing what it says, whilst asking questions about the significance of the work. How does this piece relate to other research you have read? What is different or similar about it? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the work, and how does it influence any conclusions that have been made? What concepts and or theories have been drawn from the research? Of course, the final step in note-taking is don't forget to write down the reference. Simple, yes, but it is so often forgotten. Now, there are different types of ways of taking notes. Linear or sequential notes are the most common form of note-making. It usually involves making lists, perhaps with bullets or numbers, with highlighting and underlining used to identify key or important topics. Good sequential notes include keywords, headings, and subheadings to express the connections between key concepts accompanied by extra information in the brief. This method can be a passive process, just recording what is there, so it's important to remember that the key steps outlined earlier to general note making. Visual notes are note-making methods that are non-linear, i.e. they're organised around particular concepts or ideas. Pattern notes, spider diagrams and mind maps, these use lines and arrows and circles to link key ideas. Pattern note making reduces the impulse to make notes in the order the information was presented. You have to actually spend some time reprocessing it and organising it at the point when you are writing down your information. When using visual note making, you're expressing your understanding of the information by thinking through where each aspect fits in relation to all other aspects. You are also creating a unique visual image of which may actually end up being far easier to recall. The most common form of non-linear note making is what we all commonly know as a mind map or a spider diagram. The idea with a mind map is to put the main topic at the centre of the diagram, and then the note maker builds this outwards by drawing out extra lines with ideas that link to the main topic. There are a number of other methods of visually or graphically representing what you have heard or read, and these include flowcharts or event chains, and those express different stages or sequencing of particular events or process. There are continuum scales, and these are used to rank items from one end of a spectrum to another, i.e. in a timeline, or from low to high. You also have compare and contrast matrices. Those are tables of charts which are good for showing similarities and differences between different things. There are things called fishbone maps, and these show causal interactions in very complex settings. And then you also have cycles or processes, and these emphasize a cycle or sort of patterns of repetition between different things. Now, thinking about the methods of actually conducting literature reviews, the first question that usually comes to mind is about size. How big, how much should you read? How much literature should you have a look at? Well, it really needs to be sufficient to reflect the current state of knowledge. Bias. Reviews need to be unbiased, and they need to be an unbiased representation of the current state of knowledge. Now, systematic reviews, they aim to achieve this. And we're going to talk a bit about systematic reviews in a moment. The other method of review is what we also call meta-analysis, and we're going to talk about both systematic and meta-analysis in this slide series. Most research is held electronically, so it's important to develop the skills that are needed to actually use electronic academic databases or libraries effectively using keywords. Keywords help in choosing what you need to find, and doing this well saves an awful lot of time. So systematic reviews. Literature reviews have sometimes been accused of suffering from not being thorough or potentially being biased, with the researcher just seeking out to review the literature that they want to, whether that's the literature the researcher finds more interesting, or it's the literature that most supports their theories or their way of thinking, or some other form of researcher bias. A systematic approach to reviewing literature adopts procedures to the review process and tries to lessen the presence of potential researcher bias. In this way, it is often used where research is used for decision-making purposes, and this is particularly within the field of health research. The first basic steps of a systematic review are to firstly define the purpose. So what are you setting out to do and why? This will help to provide a basis for inclusion and exclusion criteria. The second thing is to establish your selection criteria. So this will be the criteria such as time period. So are you looking for literature that's happened over the last 5 years, 10 years, 2 years, 6 months? The research design type, are you looking at literature that specifies a particular type of research design? The size of the population that has been involved in the research studies, outcomes, so on and so forth. You will then need to apply the search criteria that you've just developed to all the studies that you look at. It's important to look widely. Okay, not just to look at the research in journals, but also to look at other sources like grey literature, such as those studies that are recorded in books, that are recorded in policy documents, government research, research by charities, so on and so forth. The fourth stage is to identify and record the key features of each research study. And the fifth and final stage is about reviewing and summarising the results. Now, meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is a systematic review that contains only quantitative studies. Meta-analysis is really about the secondary analysis of the data from the research of other people. Meta-analysis summarises the results of quantitative studies and conducting analytical tests to show whether a particular variable has an effect. This will involve examining each of the studies for sampling and non-sampling error. Conducting a meta-analysis, it actually follows the same steps as a systematic review. One of the problems that we have with meta-analysis is that it relies on all of the relevant information being clearly presented and accessible. Not all research is presented in this way. Another problem is what we call the file drawer problem, and this happens when studies do not find that an independent variable has the intended effect, and this makes sometimes that research very difficult to publish, and those findings, they're just filed away in a drawer. This means that sometimes meta-analysis can be biased in favour of the independent result having some effect, as research with contradictory findings is often not publicly available. This means that we end up dealing with imperfect information. Of course, there are a number of issues with systematic reviews. Of course, one of the first things is that systematic reviews, you can't use systematic reviews where you're looking at research questions which can't be defined in variable terms. And very often in socio-economic research, we're not dealing with research questions that can be defined in variable terms. There have also been many that have said that systematic reviews actually end up bureaucratizing the literature review process, and you're looking at technicalities over, your sort of analytical interpretations. There are also questions about applying systematic reviews to qualitative studies, and of course whether we really can make objective judgments about the quality of a piece of research, and can we do that through systematic review. And there's also, of course, a question in itself, in that how do we go about assessing methodological quality? What criteria do we use to assess whether something is methodologically sound or not? Now, conducting a literature review, no matter what type of literature review you conduct and how and when, of course it requires some form of searching of research. Now, there are a number of useful ways of doing this. Starting off with a number of recommended texts and locating the sources in the bibliographies of those texts is often a very valid and very useful place to start. Electronic databases, they contain a vast number of e-journals that can be accessed using a university login. And there are, of course, many other search engines which can be helpful in finding research articles. With anything on the web, remember to think critically. It is really important, because anything can put anything they want on the internet. You need to consider key things such as who the author is and what their motive is for publishing on the internet. And you also need to think about the type of site the research is located. So is it on a government site, academic site, non-commercial, or is it a commercial organisation? Final thing to think about when searching is about keywords. The successful finding of articles relies on your ability with searching. To do this with any electronic database or search sources, it involves using the right keywords to do this. It's worth spending time at the start working at what keywords are most appropriate to make your time searching most effective. Going back to this slide on steps of note-taking, once you've identified the purpose of the literature review and figured out what questions do you need to answer, this will then give you a start in developing a set of keywords that can help you with your search.